The moment of humiliation didn't come crashing into my life with shouts or chaos. It arrived quietly, disguised as an ordinary day, slipping into the room like a shadow that no one notices until it stretches across the floor. I remember the air being still, almost too still, the kind of stillness that makes you think everything is safe. I walked in expecting warmth, or at least basic respect, because that's what you assume when you're surrounded by people who share your blood. But what I didn't realize was that sometimes the deepest wounds aren't delivered by enemies, they are delivered by familiar hands, wrapped in familiar voices, spoken with familiar faces that pretend to care. I wasn't prepared for the way everything shifted in a single moment, the way a simple sentence, a dismissive look, or a laugh that shouldn't have been there begins to tear apart something inside you that you thought was unbreakable. It started with a comment so small that anyone else would have brushed it off, but when it comes from someone you trust, it lands differently. It stings in a way that makes your chest tighten, your throat go still, your heart beat louder against your ribs. I stood there, trying to pretend I didn't notice the way they looked at me, the way their eyes slid over me like I was an inconvenience, an interruption instead of a part of the family. They talked around me, over me, through me, acting as though my presence had no weight, no meaning, no place. It was the kind of humiliation that isn't loud or dramatic, but quiet and sharp, like a thin blade pressed against the skin, not enough to kill, but enough to let you know that you won't ever forget the sting. I could feel it in the way their laughter shifted, carrying a tone that didn't belong to warmth but to mockery. It was subtle, but not subtle enough to miss when you're the one it's directed at. Even the room seemed to pull away from me, as if the walls themselves were aware that I was no longer being treated as one of their own. It's strange how fast you can go from feeling included to feeling invisible. One minute you're part of the circle, the next you're standing on the outside, watching the people you trusted reveal a side of themselves that they usually keep hidden. And the worst part is that they don't even realize how deeply they are cutting you, because for them, it's just another moment. But for you, it becomes the moment that reshapes everything. I kept my face calm, kept my posture steady, but inside something was collapsing. There's a heaviness that comes with being humiliated by your own family, a heaviness that sits right behind your ribs, making it hard to breathe normally. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to say something that would force them to see what they were doing, but the words wouldn't come. They stayed trapped somewhere between my chest and my throat, blocked by the shock that this treatment, this disrespect, was coming from people who claimed to love me. I realized then how easily love can be used as a shield to hide cruelty. How often people excuse their own actions by calling them jokes or misunderstandings, when the truth is that they simply don't value you as much as they should. That moment opened my eyes in a way nothing else ever had. I saw the small smirks exchanged between them, the way none of them stepped in to stop it, the way their silence joined with the humiliation to create a storm inside me that I struggled to contain. It made me question memories I once held close. Were those moments of kindness real, or were they just temporary pauses between the next round of disrespect? Was I ever truly seen by them, or I stood there trying to keep my expression neutral, because reacting would only give them more to laugh about. So I swallowed the hurt, pushed down the rising burn in my chest, and pretended it didn't matter. But deep inside, something was shifting, something was breaking away from the place where I had kept it buried for years. A quiet voice inside me began to speak, not loudly, not angrily, but with a steady calm that surprised me. It said to watch, to remember, to absorb every detail of this moment, because it wasn't just humiliation, it was revelation. A revelation of who they were. A revelation of who I had become in their eyes. A revelation of how long I had allowed myself to be treated as less. As I stood in that room, surrounded by laughter that wasn't mine, conversations that excluded me, and faces that pretended not to notice the hurt they caused, I knew that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't dramatic on the outside. I didn't shout, cry, or walk away. But inside, a new awareness was forming, something sharp and clear, something that would lead me down a path I never imagined I'd take. And while they continued, unaware of the shift happening within me, I felt the first spark of something powerful begin to rise from the ashes of that humiliation. Silence has a way of creeping into your life without asking permission, settling into the corners of your mind until it becomes a constant companion. After that moment of humiliation, I found myself wrapped in a silence I didn't choose, a silence that followed me into every room, every conversation, every thought. At first, it felt like weakness, like I had let them win by not speaking up, by not defending myself, by not fighting back. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that silence began to change its shape. It stopped feeling like surrender and started feeling like observation. I wasn't being quiet because I was helpless, I was being quiet because I was finally beginning to see. I watched the people around me more closely than ever before. I noticed the way they talked when they thought I wasn't really listening, the way their tone changed depending on who was in the room, the way their smiles were sometimes masks and their laughter sometimes weapons. I saw things I had ignored for years, small habits, tiny gestures, subtle expressions that revealed more than words ever could. The silence gave me space to pay attention. It gave me room to breathe, to think, to understand. The betrayal that once felt like a stab now felt like a lens, sharpening everything I looked at, showing me truths I had overlooked in the name of keeping the peace. Inside me, something was unfolding. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something steadier, something heavier, something that anchored itself deep inside my chest. Betrayal changes your definition of strength. Where I once thought strength was loud, shouting, arguing, demanding to be heard, I now saw another version growing quietly inside me. Strength can be silent. It can be patient. It can wait without losing its power. My silence was no longer the silence of someone defeated, it was the silence of someone gathering themselves, piece by piece. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment again and again. The humiliation, the laughter, the dismissive looks, they looped in my mind like an old film that refused to stop rolling. But each time I watched it, I felt a shift. What once made me feel small now made me feel alert. What once broke me now shaped me. Pain has a tendency to carve things out of you that you never knew were there. It reveals strength in the cracks, resilience in the wounds, fire in the ashes. I could feel these things rising quietly in me, growing stronger each day, fed by the very pain they had tried to use to weaken me. I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped hoping for change. I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. There is a painful liberation in. I began to withdraw, not in a way that made a scene, not in a way they'd notice immediately, but in subtle ways. A step back here, a shorter conversation there, a neutral expression that didn't reveal what I was thinking. I started responding differently. I didn't react when they tried to provoke me. I didn't flinch when they made comments meant to sting. I let their words fall flat against my calm exterior, watching their confusion grow as they realized the old patterns weren't working anymore. They didn't understand that the silence they once thought was weakness had become my shield, my focus, my foundation. Inside that silence, I was learning. Learning who I could trust. Learning who I needed to distance myself from. Learning what I would no longer tolerate. There is something powerful in that moment when you stop trying to be included. When you stop fighting for validation that should have been given freely. When you stop betraying yourself just to keep the peace with people who wouldn't blink before wounding you again. That realization didn't come all at once, it came in small waves that gradually reshaped my entire mindset. I felt myself becoming stronger with each passing day. Not louder, not angrier, but stronger in a way that couldn't be shaken by their opinions. I was building walls, not walls to isolate myself, but walls to protect the version of me that was finally emerging. I was learning to trust my instincts, the ones I had ignored for far too long, the ones that had tried to warn me every time I was brushed aside or talked down to. Those instincts grew louder in the silence, guiding me, sharpening my awareness, teaching me to see beyond the surface. And the betrayal that once felt like a burden began to feel like fuel. Every dismissive word, every mocking laugh, every careless action, they all fed that growing fire inside me. Not a fire of destruction, but a fire of transformation. a fire that made me see my own worth with a clarity I had never known. The breaking point didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion, it came slowly, creeping closer day by day until it finally stood right in front of me, undeniable and unignorable. For so long, I had convinced myself that things would get better, that the people who hurt me would eventually realize what they were doing, that love or guilt or basic decency would force them to change. I kept waiting for someone to step forward, to defend me, to acknowledge the pain they caused, to show even the slightest sign that I mattered. But the longer I waited, the more obvious it became that no one was coming. No apology, no realization, no sudden burst of conscience. Just the same patterns repeating over and over again, each cycle tightening around me like a noose I pretended I didn't see. It happened on a day that should have been ordinary, the kind of day where you expect nothing more than routine conversations and predictable moments. But all it takes is one moment for everything to shift. One comment, one gesture, one laugh at your expense that hits differently than all the others that came before it. Maybe it wasn't even the worst thing they'd ever said or done, but it landed like a final blow, a confirmation of every doubt and every fear I had pushed aside. I remember standing there, listening to them speak to me, or rather, speak at me, with that same dismissive tone that had chipped away at me for years. But something in me refused to absorb it this time. Something in me pushed back, silently but firmly, as if a voice deep inside finally rose to the surface and said, "Enough." That word echoed in my mind, repeating itself with a strength I didn't know I had. Enough of excusing the inexcusable. Enough of pretending their cruelty was unintentional. Enough of shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me. Enough of waiting for someone else to do what I should have done for myself. In that moment, the truth became painfully clear. I had been waiting for rescue from people who were the very cause of the wounds I needed rescuing from. And once you see that truth, you can never unsee it. The room felt suddenly colder, the voices around me sharper, the air heavier with a reality I could no longer avoid. I realized I had spent years giving people the benefit of the doubt they never earned, telling myself that family meant something unbreakable, something sacred. But family is not defined by blood, it is defined by behavior. It is defined by who stands with you, who respects you, who treats you with even the most basic humanity. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had done the opposite time and time again, I felt a shift so deep it was almost physical. A pulling away, a quiet detachment, as if my heart was finally stepping out of a place where it had been trapped for far too long. I didn't say anything aloud. There was no confrontation, no dramatic declaration, no outburst. But inside, something snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. I could see everything for what it truly was. How long I had been holding on to relationships that drained me more than they filled me. How much energy I had wasted trying to fix situations that were never mine to fix. How many times I had absorbed pain, believing it was my responsibility to be strong enough to endure it. I saw all the moments I had stayed silent, all the times I had swallowed my pride, all the occasions where I had let them tell me who I was supposed to be. And the realization that they had never once tried to understand me, support me, or value me hit with a way. There comes a point where your heart stops breaking and starts hardening, not in a cruel way, but in a protective one. You begin to understand that you cannot keep giving love to people who only know how to take. You cannot keep offering loyalty to those who use it as leverage against you. You cannot keep sacrificing your peace for people who barely notice when they destroy it. That point arrived for me quietly, but when it came, it settled in with unmistakable finality. I remember looking at their faces and realizing I didn't see the same people I once knew. Or maybe I finally saw them exactly as they had always been, stripped of the excuses I had layered over them. The disappointment that once weighed heavily on me began to fade, replaced by something calmer, something stronger, something that felt like self-respect beginning to take its rightful place. It was the moment I understood that staying silent and waiting for change was not strength, it was surrender. And I was done surrendering. That breaking point didn't destroy me, it awakened me. It wasn't an emotional collapse but an emotional awakening, a shift from hoping to knowing, from waiting to deciding. It was the moment I realized that if I didn't take control of my own story, they would continue writing it for me, shaping it in ways that served them and diminished me. I knew then that the version of myself that accepted mistreatment had reached the end of its life. Something new was rising in its place, something sharper, clearer, and undeniably stronger. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who had no idea a transformation was happening right in front of them, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. The certainty that I would no longer bend. That I would no longer allow myself to be handled like an afterthought. That I would no longer believe the lies they wrapped in laughter or the manipulation they dressed as concern. It was the quiet beginning of a new chapter, one fueled not by anger alone, but by the unshakable realization that I no longer needed saving from them, I only needed saving from the version of myself that tolerated them for so long. Rising from helplessness didn't look the way I always imagined it would. It didn't happen with some grand transformation, no sudden burst of confidence, no inspiring movie-style moment where everything clicked at once. Instead, it began quietly, almost invisibly, with small shifts in the way I thought, the way I reacted, the way I carried myself through rooms that once made me feel painfully small. After the breaking point, something inside me started to rearrange itself. Not loudly, but firmly. Not dramatically, but permanently. It felt like learning to walk again after years of crawling, each step shaky but deliberate, each movement filled with a focus I hadn't known I possessed. There is a strange kind of power that comes from hitting the lowest point. You expect to feel broken, but oddly, what you start feeling is clarity. I began noticing patterns I once overlooked, how predictably they dismissed me, how consistently they tried to take advantage of my silence, how confidently they assumed I would never fight back. I realized that helplessness wasn't just something they imposed on me, it was something I unknowingly participated in by accepting their version of who I was. And the moment I saw that, truly saw it, something shifted. I wasn't angry at first. I was aware. Awareness is a quiet kind of rebellion, but it is a powerful one. I started by reclaiming SMA. A new kind of strength began taking root inside me, not the loud, explosive kind people show in fights, but the steady, strategic kind that grows beneath the surface. I started thinking differently. Instead of reacting emotionally to their behavior, I began studying it. Their habits, their weaknesses, their inconsistencies, the ways they relied on my silence. I watched how they treated others too, who they respected, who they ignored, who they manipulated, who they feared. I saw clearly how predictable their behavior really was. And once you understand the pattern of someone who hurts you, you gain a kind of control over them that they never expected you to have. I found myself growing quieter on the outside but sharper on the inside. My mind was always working, always observing, always recalculating. I stopped wasting energy on arguments that went nowhere, stopped trying to convince people who were committed to misunderstanding me, stopped chasing validation that was never going to come. Every time I withheld my reaction, I felt myself gaining power. Not over them, but over myself. My emotions no longer ran wild the way they used to, my anger stopped spilling out and started simmering with purpose. Even my pain changed shape. It stopped feeling like a heavy weight and started feeling like fuel. People underestimate the power of withdrawal. Not the kind where you disappear physically, but the internal kind where you detach your emotional strings from people who once puppeteered your every reaction. They sensed it too, even if they couldn't name it. They felt the difference in the way I responded, or didn't respond. They felt the shift in the energy when their words didn't land the way they used to. They felt a new distance forming, a distance they couldn't cross as easily as before. And confusion began to creep into their expressions, because nothing unsettles manipulators more than losing access to your reactions. In the middle of this quiet transition, I discovered something else: control. Not over them, but over myself, my time, my emotions, my choices. I began planning without announcing anything. I began preparing without hinting. I began building a version of myself they didn't know how to handle. I realized that revenge wasn't about shouting or creating chaos. It was about strategy. It was about letting them believe nothing had changed while everything inside me was shifting. It was about waiting, watching, gathering strength until the moment came when their own actions would be used against them. My resolve grew in stages. At first it was just mental strength, the ability to stay calm where I once would have panicked, to stay quiet where I once would have defended myself, to stay focused where I once would have been overwhelmed. Then emotional strength followed, the ability to detach, to see things without letting them break me, to distance myself without feeling guilty for it. Finally came strategic strength, the ability to take control of the narrative they thought would always belong to them. I stopped letting them define the story. I began writing my own version, silently, carefully, thoroughly. I knew that reacting too soon would give them time to prepare. I knew that showing my strength too early would only make them try harder to sabotage it. So I stayed quiet, not because I was helpless but because I was finally thinking ahead. My silence became my planning ground. My restraint became my weapon. My patience became my advantage. And in that quiet, steady rise from helplessness, I found something I had never experienced before, a sense of independence they couldn't touch. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer feared their judgment. I no longer felt tied to their expectations. Every step forward was a reclaiming of something they had taken from me: confidence, self-worth, clarity, direction. I could feel myself becoming someone they no longer recognized, someone who didn't break easily, someone who didn't absorb wounds without consequence. What they didn't understand was that while they were focused on maintaining control, I had already slipped out of their grasp. While they were busy underestimating me, I was rebuilding myself piece by piece. While they believed they were winning, I was quietly preparing for a moment they would never see coming. Turning the tables didn't begin with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden twist, it began with small, subtle moments where the balance of power shifted without them even realizing it. The same people who once controlled the narrative, who dictated how I felt, who fed off my silence, had no idea that their influence was slipping away piece by piece. It fascinated me how blind they were to the change, how convinced they remained that I was still the same person who once absorbed their disrespect without resistance. But inside, everything had transformed. My mind was sharper, my emotions steadier, my focus clearer. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was preparing. I wasn't breaking anymore, I was building. And the moment the foundation became strong enough, the shift began. It often starts in the smallest ways. They expected me to flinch, but I didn't. They expected me to defend myself, but I stayed calm. They expected me to fold under pressure, but I stood straighter than before. These subtle changes rattled them more than any loud outburst could have. They weren't used to uncertainty. They weren't used to losing their grip. And the more they tried to provoke the old version of me, the more obvious it became that I was no longer available for their games. I wasn't giving them reactions anymore. I wasn't feeding their need for dominance. The silence that once empowered them now confused them, unsettled them, made them question themselves. I began to see their vulnerabilities, the cracks in their confidence, the points they tried to hide. People who bully others aren't strong, they are fragile in places they hope no one ever notices. But I noticed everything. Their insecurities, their lies, their emotional weak spots, their need for validation. I learned where their pride lived and where their fear hid. I learned what they couldn't handle and what exposed them. And with every observation, I gained leverage. Not to use recklessly, but to use with precision when the time came. There's a moment in every revenge story where the victim steps onto a different path, one where patience becomes a weapon and clarity becomes armor. I stepped onto that path quietly. I began controlling what I revealed. I began choosing what I responded to. I began steering conversations in ways that benefited me, not them. My strategy was not to attack, but to expose. To let them walk into the consequences of their own behavior. To give them the rope they had always expected me to hang from, but instead watch them trip over it themselves. The first real shift happened when they realized they no longer had access to my emotions. I could see it in their eyes, the confusion that crept in when their harsh words didn't make me shrink, when their manipulations didn't matter. Then came the practical shifts. I began making decisions without consulting them. I created boundaries where they had once walked freely. I removed myself from their influence in ways they couldn't stop. Every step I took toward independence destabilized the foundation they relied on. They expected me to depend on them, but suddenly I didn't. They expected me to need them, but I no longer did. And with every step I took away from them, they grew more unsettled, more desperate to regain control. Their attempts became clumsy, obvious, emotionally childish. They tried guilt, then manipulation, then anger, then passive aggression. Nothing worked. Every tactic failed because I wasn't playing the same game anymore. I had evolved into someone who didn't just see their moves, I anticipated them. I had studied them for so long they became predictable. And predictability is the weakest position a manipulator can be in. And then the real turning began. Not through revenge fueled by anger, but through consequences fueled by truth. I began revealing things they assumed I would always hide. I started speaking up in moments where they expected silence. I called out lies they were confident would go unchallenged. I presented facts they had hoped would stay buried. And each time I did, the room shifted. Each truth was like a stone dropped into calm water, sending ripples that unsettled everything around them. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match their aggression. I didn't show anger. My calmness made it hit harder, because nothing unnerves someone more than realizing they have no control over the version of you standing in front of them. People who once dismissed me started listening. People who once ignored my words began paying attention. People who once sided against me began questioning everything they had been told. Their influence weakened while mine grew quietly in the background. And the delicious part was that they didn't realize how or when it happened. They just looked around one day and noticed they were no longer the ones holding the reins. I didn't destroy them with rage. I let them destroy their own reputations by exposing their true selves. I didn't sabotage their relationships. I simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their actions. I didn't need to strike first. All I had to do was stop cushioning their blows and watch as their own behavior finally caught up with them, right in front of the very people they had fooled for so long. And when the tables fully turned, it wasn't chaotic. It was silent. A quiet collapse that came not from what I did to them, but from what I stopped allowing them to do to me. They lost the control they once believed they owned. They lost the confidence they built on my silence. They lost the version of me that kept them powerful. And in that loss, they began to feel the weight of everything they had put me through, just not in the way they expected. The most unexpected part of all of this was not the revenge itself, but the effect it had on everyone around me, especially the ones who had caused the damage in the first place. I had always assumed they would either ignore the shift or mock it the way they mocked everything else. I thought they would brush it off, pretend not to notice, or twist the narrative so they could keep seeing themselves as powerful. But when the moment finally arrived, when the consequences they never believed would touch them began unfolding, they reacted in ways I never could have predicted. People who once spoke with confidence now stumbled over their words. People who once raised their voices now hesitated. People. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about shouting or exposing or attacking. It was the quiet weight of accountability settling over them like a shadow they couldn't escape. They realized too late that the person they had underestimated for so long was no longer the same person standing before them. I didn't need to embarrass them publicly or destroy them emotionally. I simply let them face the truth they had spent years avoiding. They began to see themselves through the eyes of others, and for the first time, their actions didn't look clever or justified, they looked cruel, petty, and transparent. People around them started asking questions. Why did they treat me that way? Why did they assume no one would notice? Why did they talk with authority when everything they said was built on lies? The more questions people asked, the more their carefully constructed facade began to crumble. It was almost surreal watching their confidence dissolve, watching the certainty drain from their expressions as they realized the story they had been spinning for so long no longer held power. They had counted on my silence, my compliance, my fear. They never imagined I would one day simply stop playing the role they wrote for me. And the irony was that the collapse didn't come from anything dramatic I did. It came from everything I no longer allowed. I no longer let them define me. I no longer let them speak over me. I no longer let them twist facts or rewrite history. For the first time, I spoke clearly, calmly, and truthfully, and truth has a way of unsettling those who built their strength on deception. They weren't ready to face the version of me that looked them in the eye without flinching, without apologizing, without second-guessing. They weren't ready for a version of me that understood their tactics, anticipated their behavior, and refused to fall into the traps they'd been setting for years. The shock in their faces wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was the kind of expression people wear when they suddenly realize they've miscalculated something important, something fundamental. They tried to regain control at first, subtle remarks, attempts to manipulate conversations, little bursts of anger meant to intimidate me back into my old place. But every attempt only exposed their desperation. They no longer understood how to manage a situation where I didn't crumble under pressure or react the way they were used to. They had spent so long mastering how to push me down that they never prepared for what would happen if I stood up. Even the people who once sided with them began to shift their stance. They saw the change in me. They saw the truth in my words. They saw the strength in my silence and the clarity in my decisions. And in that shift, the ones who caused the damage found themselves standing alone, without the support they had taken for granted for so long. It wasn't that others turned against them, it was simply that people began seeing things as they truly were, not as they had been manipulated to believe. Once the truth becomes visible, it can't be unseen, and they felt that truth pressing against them from every direction. What surprised me most was how they reacted, not with the arrogance they once used as armor, but with confusion, discomfort, and a quiet kind of fear they didn't know how to hide. They began treading carefully around me, watching their words, monitoring their tone, evaluating every move as if trying to avoid triggering a reaction they no longer knew how to predict. They treated me with a caution that bordered on respect, though they wouldn't admit it aloud. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition. Recognition of the fact that I had stepped out of their control completely. But the shock wasn't limited to them. It extended to people who had watched everything silently over the years. They were stunned not just by what I had endured, but by how I emerged from it, stronger, calmer, sharper, wiser. They hadn't expected me to find my voice. They hadn't expected me to gather the strength I did. They hadn't expected me to stand so firmly on ground they thought would always be unstable beneath my feet. The quiet respect in their eyes was a kind of validation I never sought but deeply understood. And then there was the internal shock, the realization within myself that I had grown into someone capable of standing through storms without bowing. I felt different. Grounded. Unshakable. I no longer feared confrontation because my power didn't come from being right, it came from knowing the truth. I no longer feared losing people because I understood now that anyone who truly valued me wouldn't have put me through this in the first place. The clarity that settled in my mind was both comforting and liberating. The final surprise was how peace replaced the anger I once carried. Not because I forgave them, but because I no longer needed their apology. I no longer needed validation or closure from people who never intended to give it. Their reaction, their shock, their unraveling, none of it was for revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of my growth, the inevitable result of me stepping into my strength while they remained stuck in the patterns that once held power over me. And watching that shift, watching the ones who once caused pain become unsettled by the strength they never thought I'd find, was the moment I realized I had already won.